Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. It is great to be doing another joint event between Women on Boards and Women in Telco and Technology, or WOB and WiTT as we know them. For those of you who don't know me, I've been involved with both networks for a long time. I was looking back in my records and I actually attended my first WiTT meeting 17 years ago in April 2004. And I was a founding director at Women on Boards in the UK in 2012. So it is especially satisfying for me to see both organisations still going strong in 2021, supporting women with their career and boardroom ambitions. So our focus this evening is on the intersection of the two organisations, specifically board roles in the tech sector. And we have three great panel members to help broaden and deepen your understanding of the supply and demand dynamics around gaining access to non-executive roles on technology company boards, both large and small. It's also worth noting that companies across most sectors are becoming increasingly technology dependent as software takes over the world, and that's reflected in roles that are available to anyone with solid tech sector experience. So each of our panel members will provide some insight into their backgrounds, with Cynthia providing a perspective from the world of early stage tech companies, Jacqui sitting on several larger listed company boards, and Mary bringing the headhunter perspective. I'm going to be the MC this evening. And to give you an idea of my background, I spent the first 23 years of my career in the IT industry, working across Australia, Europe, Japan, North America. And whilst I started out in software development, once the dot-com boom arrived, I broadened out into the world of the internet in one of the very first global data center companies. And the final 6 to 8 years of that part of my career were primarily based in Silicon Valley. And then when the dot-com bust hit in 2001, I took a year out at London Business School to refresh and expand my brain. And since then, I've been working almost exclusively with for-purpose organizations rather than the for-profit sector. My personal interest in the boardroom was triggered early on in my career because I had a first startup experience in the 1980s as co-founder of an IT services business. And although I sat on the board not as an executive director, I was intrigued by the value added by our two non-execs. So I filed it away then when I was still in my late 20s as something I wanted to do. And over the past 15 years, I've sat on 8 boards across the charity, government and private sectors, whilst also helping build Women on Boards since its UK launch in 2012. So as many of you know, Women on Boards exists to support our members with their board ambitions through a mixture of information, inspiration, encouragement and connections. And tonight's event continues in that tradition. My role as a founder and inaugural chair at WOB UK was inspired by the anger I felt looking around in my 50s and realizing how uneven the playing field still was for women, not just in the boardroom and senior leadership, but also in things like raising startup capital, academia, politics and beyond. So I'm going to hand over to Audrey now for a few words about WiTT, and then we will kick off the main event.
Women in Telecoms and Technology, for those of you who are not members of our group, is the networking group for women in tech, as it sounds like it is. We run events roughly every month, generally speaking, focused on tech topics such as ethics and AI, 5G, tech and COVID, tech and climate change, women entrepreneurs, etc. Our aim is primarily to highlight women with expertise in our sector, educate women on key trends in the sector, and also create networking opportunities which might lead to mentoring and might lead to new roles of various sorts, not only board related roles. And we celebrated our 20th anniversary last year. WiTT was founded by Stephanie Liston, who I believe is on the call. Stephanie is currently chair of the Jersey Competition Regulatory Agency and also of the Broadband Stakeholders Group. And our other board directors also on the call are Annette Nabavi, Michelle Senecal, Helen Kaliski, and Yasmin Majid. So I will hand it back to you, Rowena.
Thanks, Audrey. And I'll just repeat the data protection warning that we are recording this session so that others can take advantage of it in the future. So what that means for you really is that if you don't want your photo to appear, if you get involved in the Q&A session later, just keep your camera turned off. We would ask you to submit your questions in the chat as we go along, and then we will have a Q&A session once the panel is over, and Fiona will be curating the questions for us and give you the option. You can either let Fiona read your question or come in and ask them. So our objectives this evening are really threefold: to broaden your understanding of the range of opportunities out there to serve on boards and committees of organizations in the tech sector and beyond, to give you a deeper understanding of how your skills and experience are transferable to the boardroom, and then to provide insight into how best to approach the process of securing a board role, as well, of course, to give you the opportunity to meet others with similar ambitions and background. So our first speaker this evening is Mary Lawrance. So rather than, Mary moved into executive search after spending her early career in the tech sector, and she's going to set the scene for us this evening by talking about the role headhunters play in the board recruitment space. So I'll hand over to you now, Mary, if you'd like to unmute yourself and go ahead.
Hello. Great. Okay. Hi. I mean, basically, I'll just do a very brief summary of my background. I started in the tech industry. I worked in Silicon Valley, working as a product marketeer on lasers and networking. And then I worked for Philips Electronics in Europe on distribution and also on chips. And then I moved into management consulting with PA Consulting Group. So I worked at obviously technology consulting, but it was focused on security. Particularly, I know an awful lot about airport security. I mean, that was my expertise. But then I built a career in headhunting, and I spent the first 10 years of my headhunting career working in the big top tier, as they call themselves, American search firms. And during that time, I worked in the tech practice, I worked in the board practice, I worked I spent a bit of time in the security practice in Washington with DC and when I was with Heidrick. And I've done everything. I mean, I've done FTSE, I've done on the board, this is board work, FTSE work, I've done private equity, I've done quite a bit of public sector, actually, senior level public sector work, but only when they were looking for commercial skills and more technology type skills. I haven't done public sector searching into public sector. I've done it sort of looking for commercial skills. And I've done quite a lot of smaller businesses, but it tends to be scale ups, not startups. So we've got an expert on the smaller business, on the startup scene, which is not an area I know much about in terms of board work. And so I suppose I just worked out, I've probably got about 25 years in headhunting, which makes me feel very old. And I also, every time I think I've seen it all before, something happens that surprises me. And it's really the clients, actually. The clients are generally pretty predictable. It's the candidates that are always doing up to something random. But it's actually it's been a great experience. And I'm going to sort of give a view of the market. And I was thinking about this afternoon and doing a bit of prep. And I honestly don't think there has ever been a better time to be a senior woman with technology experience if you want to join a board. It's almost the point where you'd kind of be mad not to do it, or at least try and do it. And the reason for that, and there's some very good reasons for that. And the first is there's really strong headwinds. There's a lot of stakeholder and investor pressure, and it's hitting my clients on all sides, which is great. I mean, it really is. People do accept that boardroom diversity is very important. It's important for business, and that's accepted now, particularly within the investor community, which is great, which is what we need. And there's an awful lot of support out there. I mean, there's women on boards, which are, both organisations very well established, and there's lots of help and support out there. And we have a buoyant industry, and the market at the moment is really, really busy, and there's a lot of exciting opportunities. And every single company needs tech savvy at the board level. And other sectors are all tech dependent. I mean, I've done a lot of work in energy, I've worked in aerospace, I've worked in transport, I'm now working in healthcare, and it's all so tech dependent now. I mean, you know, banks call themselves tech firms now. I mean, it's just, you know, there's so much going on, and we've got such a tricky corporate environment. It's hard. I mean, the sector is buoyant, but the issues at board level are hard. I mean, we've got COVID. We've got geopolitical issues. I mean, real instability. I've done a bit of work in the security, well, a lot of work in the security industry, and they're kind of terrified at the moment, to be honest. And we've got, you know, the horrible Brexit word, but there's a huge amount of instability out there. And so boards are actually becoming a lot more keen about, we really need the best talent, and they cannot afford to overlook. To be honest, people who have been overlooked before, I'll be honest, I've been in the industry for 25 years. And you know, I got so fed up of being the only female consultant in the tech practice, or the only one in the board practice doing the tech stuff. There were plenty of lady researchers who were much brighter than most of the guys. But I just got fed up with it now. And now there are a lot more women. There's a lot of women doing network, doing headhunters doing network. And in fact, there always have been. There's always been a good showing of headhunters, female headhunters in network, particularly at the senior levels. But there's still a kind of shortage of us doing tech, but it's getting a lot better. And that makes a big difference, because it means, I think it makes a big difference because there's all sorts of questions that you can ask and things you can talk about to a female headhunter that are kind of tricky with guys sometimes. I mean, I've had conversations with very senior Neds about clothing advice and things like that. You know, I've got to go to a fusty club. What do I wear? I've got to meet this high profile chairman who, you know, I've seen him online, you know, he's in the House of Lords most of the day. You know, what do I wear to go to that? And, you know, as a woman, you can have that conversation. So, you know, my view on the market is quite simple. It's very good at the moment for ladies in technology, and it's also for very good reasons as well. I mean, very good, you know, factual reasons. And I think Rowena's got some things that she wanted to sort of particular things she wanted to sort of raise in terms of the sort of thing your members are looking for.
Yeah, I mean, starting off, if I'm an executive and I don't currently have any connections with headhunters, because of, you know, the type of work I'm doing, how should I get started building the right relationships to get considered for non-exec roles?
Yeah, this is a really important question, actually, because it's a hard thing to do. And there's two sides to it. There's building the connections and the proactivity you need to do that. And there's also the other side, which is how to make yourself more visible. So I'll deal with the first side first. The first side, if you want to, the best way of building connections with headhunters is networking and doing your own research and doing your own networking. You can do a lot of online research and find out a lot about headhunters there, but also through your own networking. Ask for recommendations. Ask not ladies who are non-execs who they use. Go online, have a look, do your own research. People like Women on Boards, for example, there's lots of great resource out there, lots of organizations that can help you. And then once you've found the people that you think are right, then go on the website and look at the consultant bios and connect with everybody you think is going to be relevant to you. And pick the tech practice and the board practice. Pick both, because a lot of board work, a lot of NED work actually happens in the tech practice. Because what happens in the big firms is that if you're in the tech practice and you get a really good board role, you don't give it to the board practice. I never did at Hydrick, I did it myself. And so, you connect with both, and don't forget the researchers. You've got the big executive search firms, you've got the NED specialists, and you've got the tech specialists. So the big executive search firms, yes, you have to approach them. The NED specialists, yes, you have to approach them. And then have a look at the tech specialists and just have a look at their websites, and you'll get a view. Look at the case studies. You'll get a view who does NED work and who really doesn't. And so you can do that. And the other thing that's important is what headhunters we call sourcing, and that means we call and ask for recommendations. So if you get a call from a headhunter and they say, or a note from they might randomly message you on LinkedIn and say, do you know anybody who might be good for this search? If you can help, help. If you can't help, don't worry, it doesn't matter. Headhunters make loads and loads of those source calls, so they're not going to hold it against you. I'm not going to put a mark on I'm not going to ask her again, because that actually is a good way of building up a good way of building up relationships, and it's also a good way of actually being known in your market as well. They'll come back and ask you again. And then the second thing is making yourself easy to find. And there's the obvious things: raise visibility. You could do it by speaking, you could do it by writing, you could networking. I mean, networking is the key. I'm going to keep saying the word networking. I'm going to get fed up of me saying it, but networking is really important. But LinkedIn, I think LinkedIn is really important here. Make sure you have a good profile on LinkedIn and you're clearly labeled as looking for NED appointments. And that's really important. But just one caveat: check with your employer first, because if they look in your profile and see you're looking for NED appointments and you haven't checked with them and they're not happy, that might be a problem. And it's if you're in a job now and you're looking for your first NED appointment, it'll be the first thing that a headhunter will ask you. So just put that caveat on it. But it's two things: make the connections, network, find the recommendations, but also make yourself visible, make sure they can find you.
And in terms of the nature of a relationship you normally have with your client, how well do you typically understand the culture and challenges of an organization as the headhunter? So how much digging can an applicant do with you about the organization?
Lots. We know them really, really well. I actually worked in management consulting and actually did some strategy consulting before I transitioned into headhunting. And in fact, the big headhunting firms all came out of the big strategy consulting firms, because we talk about strategy to our clients all the time. It's all about the strategic view. So we know the client, we know our clients very, very well, and we wouldn't work for them if we didn't know them well. You've got to be quite careful who you work with sometimes, as we all know. And the answer is very well, and don't underestimate that. And if a headhunter doesn't know something, they can go back to the client and ask. I mean, there will be things that the headhunter may not know. But
good questions can give you some real insight that can, set you up for a good interview.
And please ask the headhunter before any interview. A headhunter should actually either make a call before the interview or at least offer you a call. And throughout the whole process, the headhunter should always be, I always say, any questions, drop me a note, give me a call. Throughout the whole process, you should get that level of service, because remember, we work on a retained basis. We're not agencies. We don't get a commission every time we send in a CV. It doesn't work like that, So, do push the headhunter for information and make sure you get it.
What are the one or two things that non-exec candidates most often get wrong, either in their applications or in their interviews, in your experience?
Yeah, this is really interesting, because I always find it more interesting why people don't get jobs. It's more interesting often than why people do, because often it's pretty obvious why someone's got a job. And the number one bit of feedback I get, the number one reason why people don't get that non-executive role, is that lack of consultative and strategic approach at interview. Because it's really, really hard if you've been a senior person, an operational person, and you're used to sort of, taking control and being in charge, to actually stop and listen and take that big picture strategic view. It's really hard. You can't be a strategy consultant overnight, just and take that approach overnight. But that is the number one reason. And I've had some really quite high profile people rejected from some of the sort of smaller businesses, the scale up businesses, for that reason, because the CEO, and the CEO particularly, is the one who'll say, this person's going to try and start running my business, and that's my job. It's the CEO actually, rather than the chairman, who is the one who tends to come back with that feedback. But that is the number one bit of feedback. And the second thing that some people don't really understand is they don't appreciate how competitive it is. And this is the second issue, because what happens if the normal the normal person going for a NED role has done pretty well at school, pretty well at uni, pretty well in their career, and suddenly they're competing in a whole different world. And sometimes they just don't realize how competitive it is. And that's actually quite easy to handle. They just, because they've forgotten the basics. They just haven't done the preparation because they didn't quite appreciate how tough it would be. And I've had candidates come out of meetings quite taken back by how tough the meeting has been. And it's nearly always lack of preparation. It's old-fashioned interview advice. Know the market, know the company, and know the board. Look into that board, look who they are, find out who they are, make sure you know. And also sometimes, just a sort of side point to that, sometimes it's actually just the wrong board. You've got to remember, if you don't get a board role, sometimes it's just not the board for you. It's not the right board. If you don't get on with them, sometimes you just don't get on with them. So if you're rejected for one of these positions, sometimes it's just the wrong board for you. And it's so important not to get disillusioned. It's so important to think, right, not the right board for me. It's a big commitment. You don't want to be on the board.
Yeah.
And then move on.
That's great. Thank you, Mary. I think we will close it off there for now. Plenty more time in the Q&A session, and move on to our next speaker, Jacqui Ferguson, who has had a very international career in the tech sector and I think you took on your first listed non-exec role at Wood in 2016, and you've been building your NED portfolio since then. And Jacqui's roles are actually a perfect example of how important technology has become across a lot of industry sectors. So I will hand over to you now, Jacqui, to take it from there.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the opportunity to join such a great group of interested folks. So first of all, let me just give you a little bit of my kind of executive background. So 30 years in the sort of technology industry. And if you remember 30 years ago, we didn't have the internet and we didn't have mobile phones. And we didn't even have email when I started out in the tech industry. So I've seen a lot in the last 30 years. I did my first 10 years actually at KPMG, where I was part of computer audit and security and information technology. And I actually spent the first 10 years being pretty technical. And I guess, if you think about computer audit and security now as being much more front of mind. The second 10 years of my career I spent with an American IT services company called Electronic Data Systems, to those of you who know the IT landscape. So they were a company who were involved in a lot of what you might say were transformational technology projects for all sorts of industries. So Mary mentioned earlier she knew a lot about airport security. I actually had a big project in the year 2000 for a travel company who had operations in airports and cruise ships and whatnot. And the travel sector was one of those first industries that moved in as Rowena said, at the dot-com boom. And latterly, the third 10 years of my career were spent with Hewlett-Packard, where I became, I guess, more commercial and more executive. And during that period of time, I ran a number of different businesses. I operated across all of Europe. I spent some time working in Singapore and covering kind of the Asia region, and then latterly spent 3 years living and working in Silicon Valley as Chief of Staff at Hewlett-Packard. And that was really my first exposure to working with boards, where I worked with the board of Hewlett-Packard in that capacity, alongside the CEO and chairman at the time, Meg Whitman. So that was a great first experience into how do boards operate and how do tech boards operate. Latterly, I moved back to the UK, and the business that I was running for Hewlett-Packard, which was the services business, was sold in 2017. And I never thought I would have gone portfolio non-executive, but I think as Rowena has said, and Mary has said, there's such a lot of demand for people with technology backgrounds on boards. And it had been, I think Mary had mentioned this as well, this is a very important piece of guidance that she gave you around, if you are looking for a non-executive role, it is good to talk to your organization first. So I actually had the support of Hewlett-Packard as part of my development plan to actually look for a non-executive role, and actually having that support from the organization helped helped make some of those inroads to the headhunting companies that could help me find my first role. And when I took on when I was looking for my first role, I would say, I got a lot of good advice from people on how to develop my CV, and it's a very, very different CV for a board role as it is for an executive job, because it really talks to what are your transferable skills and what skills can you bring that can add value at the board level. So I took quite a bit of time figuring out what those transferable skills would be, and I encourage you to reflect on your careers and experiences so that you can figure out what your transferable skills are, because these are the things that will be written in the job specification for the non-executive non-executive profile. And for me, those experiences where the ability to live and work internationally, being involved in a lot of transformation. I'd spent quite a bit of time working on company strategy when I was in the US, so that was one of the big boxes. I'd worked a lot with mergers and acquisitions. So whilst we talk about ourselves as coming from the technology sector, you've got to think about your skills and experiences being more rounded than just the pure technical piece, because I'm sure all of you have different types of experiences, whether it be in compliance or whether it be in sales or emerging markets, etc., etc. So I look at my career today. So I had my first non-executive role in 2016. So that's coming up 5 years now on Wood PLC, and what they were looking for in their board profile was somebody who had experience of a services business model, which was, although a different industry, that was the experience I had at Hewlett-Packard. They were looking for somebody with a technology expertise, which I had from further back in my career, and they were looking for somebody who'd operated internationally because they operate in 70 countries. So as I think Mary said, when boards are building a profile of the perfect candidate, quite often they're looking for the odd unicorn or two out there. So they're looking for more than one dimension. They don't always get the unicorn, but I think they try hard to look for multiple dimensions, and sometimes those are the things that will tip you in the balance, for that board role. So I look at my other boards. So my second board was Tesco Bank. It's part of Tesco PLC, and coming from a technology background, lots of people say, well, what are you doing on a bank? Well, of course, it's entirely a digital bank, and so there's a lot of transformation and investment going on. At Tesco PLC, they'd had a big cyber incident about 6 months before I joined. So those were the impetus for them to look for somebody with a technology background. The third board I'm on is a specialty chemicals company called Croda. It's a FTSE 100. It's a very innovative and fast-paced business. And when you sort of think about, them as well, they're a global company. They're operating in 70 geographies. They're doing a lot of acquisitions, and they're trying to build their B2B, if you like, customer digital interface, and they're looking at digitizing their whole supply chain. So bringing those different dimensions, in terms of, made me sort of quite a good fit for Croda. And also when you're looking at these businesses, I think Mary said it early, chemistry is really, really important. And in each of the 3 boards interview processes that I went through, the chemistry felt good. And I have been to a number of interviews where things did not go so well. And I also, actually, if you're not excited about the company or the business they're in, that always comes through, I think, in any interview. So I think I interviewed for a company that made bricks, and I couldn't get excited about it. So I'm just saying, when you're looking at potential boards, go for something where there, you feel that you can bring some value add, but also that you'll get something out of it. And I think Mary said it earlier as well, why is tech in so much demand? But well, all businesses have a need for tech, and even more so, I would say, after the last 3 years. I get a lot of calls from headhunters, although my portfolio is pretty good at the moment. I'm not looking to expand. I always take the calls. As Mary said, I always pass along names and recommendations, because you are actually in a small community, and you will all know this because you're in the telecoms and technology sector. But there are only 17% of the workforce in telecoms and technology are females. So if you're in the senior echelons in your organizations, you're in less than 1% of the population. So you're a small set of unicorns all here on your own today. Rowena talked about being on a tech board. Well, you could say, at least 2 of my businesses are quite tech centric, but they're not technology boards. But in the UK, there's actually not that many technology boards. So you can pretty much, if you're targeting a technology board, you can pretty much go straight to the FD and look at the FTSE 350, the AIM listed, and have a look for those technology companies. I think there is only 2 in the FTSE 100, which I think is Sage and Micro Focus. There's a bunch more in the FTSE 250. Computer Center, Softcat, etc. And then there's a lot more going on in the startup space. But I think that's sort of my a guidance to you is to quick figure out what your transferable skills are, what you can bring to a board, and then what do you want to get out of it too.
Thank you, Jacqui. And just so everyone knows, Jacqui did a podcast for us back at the end of 2019, and she talks through, how she unpacked those transferable skills. And when I listened to it, I just thought that is a masterclass of doing it. So she touched on them today, but I would highly recommend that podcast for everyone who is going through that really challenging process of trying to articulate what is it that they're going to add in the boardroom, and just so that it's kind of ongoing, never-ending process, I find. Right, so our third speaker, Cynthia, is a tech veteran who's been mostly based in New York and London, but has also worked across Europe, in Germany, the Netherlands, France, and also in India. And since 2016, she's been active on the early stage tech scene as a mentor, an angel, a board member. And so Cynthia's going to talk to us about that side of the market now. So over to you, Cynthia.
Hi, thank you, Rowena. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. Good evening, everyone. It's so nice to finish the day in such great company. So let's talk about the startups and how to get on a board. So sometimes an advisory board or as a non-executive director.
Do tell us a bit about your background as well.
Yes, of course. Where is this all coming from? Thank you. I started in banking, not very original. Merrill Lynch and Morgan Stanley. I got very lucky to get hired by a tech company, which was not the sexiest thing at the time, back in 2006. The company was called Market. If you're in finance, you know who they are. It's a bit like Bloomberg and Reuters. They do data. I started, we were about, actually less than 20 people in New York. By the time I left, 11 years later, we were 12,000 people. So we had really grown. So I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly of growth from a product point of view, from a commercial point of view, from an international point of view. There are product launch that we got right and some that we got really wrong. There are acquisitions we got right and acquisitions we got wrong. So I've definitely learned everything that I know about product and tech from that experience. We IPO'd on the NASDAQ at 5 billion at the time. It's north of 30 billion now. We merged then with IHS, which is another data company, and it's about to be bought actually this year if it's approved by S&P. So having gone through this whole growth from literally startup, early stage, all the growth, all the way to IPO is pretty amazing. You definitely get to learn a lot. After that, I decided to go back to my entrepreneurial roots and to start doing angel investment. And this is kind of how I got into not only investment, but working much more closely with startups. So I started as a mentor with Techstars. Then I got hired by King's College to be their investor in residence. They have an accelerator in-house and they need someone to work with the startups on their investment strategy. And that led me to my role at Founders Factory, where I was the managing director and head of FinTech. And there we had to, it's a bit like a VC, you know, you have to find startups, invest in them, and then also accelerate them, which meant also working extremely closely with them. And also starting 2 startups a year in the incubator. So that was pretty full on, and now I'm a VC investor. Should our board, obviously, I am on 4 boards, 3 startups as a non-executive director, 1 startup as an observer, so not as a non-executive. And I'm also on the board of a European agency called JEDI, the Joint European Disruptive Initiative, which is an equivalent of DARPA in the States. And with them, I have also been part of a few European delegations representing European interest in Washington, DC. And apart from that, I'm also a mentor, still at King's College, also at Imperial. And I have done a few as well at Stanford University in California. And I also do a lot of office hours with tech startups, but also with tech female founders.
So in terms of people who are interested in the startup board scene, what have you learned? How do you get access to those type of roles?
Yeah, so it's actually a bit trickier because there aren't any job postings for those. If you work pre-seed, seed, all the way to Series A, at Series B, probably Mary would probably start having job postings, but before that, it's a bit trickier. So the way you find those roles, I mean, it's going to sound very simple, but be where the startups are. So get to go and meet with them. There are a lot of ways to do that. It can be, you know, go to demo days, you know, for accelerators, you know, like Techstars, the Y Combinator, Founders Factory, Level 39, and so on. Just showing up to demo days and getting to see the startups, and then, you know, approaching the ones that, you know, you kind of had a good feeling about. That's one way of doing it. I would say also talk to the universities you went to. A lot of them may have accelerators, you know, that you may not even know about, or programs to help startups. So that's another way, or a university close to you. You know, that everyone is always looking for support, you know, from mentors. So I think mentoring is probably a good way to, 1, meet startups, get a sense of the ones you would want to work with, and also meet other mentors. Because this is also where, if I join a board, I'm going to want to bring, or at least recommend, other people that could be complementary to me. And the CEO will be asking, you know, who else could we bring on board with that skill set? So they will also rely on you to bring or think about other people. So getting to know either other non-executive directors or other mentors is also extremely important. Founders at that stage, as I said, they won't be in jobs postings. They can't afford just yet a recruiter. So they will rely on the people closest to them to advise them on, you know, who should be joining the advisory board or the board. So I think, yeah, be where the startups are and network, which is something that Mary already mentioned several times, network with other mentors and with other NEDs. The other thing is the investor scene. Talk to investors. You don't have to be an investor. Obviously, it helps if you are. But if you know investors and if you know VCs, they may also be looking, you know, for people to come and help their startups. So if they know that you have a specific skill set, they're definitely going to call and say, hey, we do have that startup. We just invested in them. We do need a new non-executive director. We've thought about you. You know, what do you think about it? And on the investment bit, you do not need to be an investor to be a non-executive director in a startup, but that is definitely one path. So be aware of it. But I would say do not invest in a startup unless you know what you're doing. Audrey is involved with Angel Academy, so am I, so a lot of people there. And being an angel helps a lot, for sure. But yeah, don't start investing just so that you can get onto a board. That may not be a straight line there. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yes, and I know actually Sarah Turner is on this call as well, who is the founder of the fabulous Angel Academy, a very female-focused angel network. And as you said, Cynthia, Audrey, and myself, and quite a few of us are investors through Angel Academy. So thank you. Right, if that was all you wanted to say, Fiona, do we have some questions?
We do have some questions. Michelle, would you like to unmute yourself? You know you're coming in, and then Nia next, and ask your question, please.
Where boards recognise that they're looking for the best talent. So this is something I heard Mary say earlier, which I also read and hear about quite often. They refer to the best talent, but I'm wondering to what extent they frame that narrowly in terms of the sector they're in, or very sort of strict technical expertise, or where we're hearing a lot about cognitive diversity and the importance of that, whether they broaden the specification they're appointing to embrace people with different backgrounds that can still add value to the technical issues they're facing as a board.
Mary, do you want to have a go at that one?
Yeah, I'll have a go at that one. Yeah, that's actually a really good question. And I think people sometimes have a misconception about board hiring, that somehow it's about a job spec, and it isn't. It really is about finding the very best person. And although I can't have a direct answer there and talk about, do they do it or don't they, because I only speak to a few boards, but I think you'll find that boards are a lot more open-minded than you would expect them to be. But you've also got to understand that they can't put that in the jobs, they can't put that in the briefing notes or refer to that, because cognitive diversity strays kind of into health information as well. So to answer your question, yes, people are a lot more open-minded. Board level, clients are much more open-minded, believe me, at board level than they are for executive roles. Executive roles, they know what they want and they need a slot to be filled. Board, it's much more open-minded. And to answer your question, yes, cognitive diversity is very important at that level, but you won't find much information about it out there simply because of the data protection health information about people. So it's a tricky one. It's just a tricky one from that perspective.
Can I just comment on that as well, Mary, because when I read that question, I read a little bit about, is tech quite a narrow thing to focus on tech boards? But in my experience of working with technology company boards, is an awful lot of the makeup of the board comes from non-tech environments. So for example, on the board of Hewlett Packard, we had the chairman who was the chairman of McDonald's, absolutely zero tech background, and it's incredibly valuable to have that fresh perspective of, okay, what's this technology going to do for me in my industry? So I think when boards are looking at the expertise, they're looking at the collection of what they already have around the table, and then how they can build that collective experience and make it as valuable as possible.
Is it okay if I just comment on that?
Yeah.
I'm so encouraged to hear those two responses. And part of my reason for asking the question is that I've actually been looking at boards, not just the specifications of boards I may want to join, or if they actually have a vacancy. I always look to see the composition of the board. I've also been looking at AIM-listed companies to have a look at their boards, and I'm struck at how often their board is actually narrowly defined in terms of their competencies. So they're actually very much a like for like in terms of who's already on the board, which makes me wonder, when they're looking to replace somebody who might be about to retire, to what extent they're looking beyond their additional, their current expertise and competency. So really encouraged by your response, and I would love to think that's the case going forward.
And I think Mary actually strongly pointed out that life and things have really changed recently, and you are seeing a change in behaviour. I've got Nia next, who asked a question, a fascinating question. So Nia, if you want to come in, then I've got Sarah, and then I've got Lara. Nia.
Thanks, Fiona. So my question is, it's a basic question really. It's about how do you define the tech sector? So I hear tech used a lot as a synonym for IT, but my background is in physics, scientific instruments and intellectual property. I'm a patent attorney, and then moving into science policy. And I wonder sometimes, do I fit in that tech box? And is the tech box, do people like me fit in that box?
I'll ask
probably get
Mary
a different answer from all of us, actually.
I'll ask Mary to answer that, Cynthia, and then we'll go to Jacqui, because I think Rowena's got a very good point there.
I just want to make a quick comment to you, Nia. The answer is yes, and I have spent so much time working with very scientifically based companies looking for people on their boards. And I want to come back to what Jacqui said, in that technology boards don't look for the specific technology. That if I get a candidate who has that specific technology and the senior level position, the senior level work, they will always interview that candidate, but they very rarely pick them. They cast their net very wide. And so to answer your question, yes, your experience is extremely relevant. In my world, because I came up through the scientific route rather than the software route, I actually kind of prefer that experience because I think it's more transferable. I think it's very difficult for somebody with a software background to move into deep tech, but a deep tech person can do software. So, does that answer your question?
Yes, great.
Cynthia, what are your comments? And then Jacqui.
I completely agree with Mary there. Actually, I'm not from a scientific background or an engineering background. I'm from a business background. So sometimes I feel like a fraud in tech. And if it had not been for my experience working firsthand on product and with developers, I don't think I would be having the skill set and the knowledge that is necessary and required to be good at what we do. But the answer is absolutely yes, Nia. You have the right mindset, you have the right experience, you have the right knowledge, you have the right expertise. IP is extremely important in tech, like extremely important. So this is extremely transferable at every stage, whether it's early or growth. And you have the way of solving problems that is very, like the way you think from a scientific point of view is exactly how you solve problems on the tech side. So the answer is, 10 times yes, for sure.
Great.
Jacqui, anything to add there?
Yeah, I think there's this, in the UK in particular, there feels like there's a bit of a division between engineering and technology, but in almost every other country of the world, they're the same thing. So I would say with your background, particularly, IP, that's a very transferable skill to a lot of different industries. And your background in physics and science and innovation, I could imagine there's a lot of different institutions that would be quite interested with your skill sets. In fact, I saw a government board that's just been established, ARIA, the sort of Association for Innovation Research, and I'm sure your background would look quite good to an organisation that's going to be investing in new technologies. So you definitely think broadly about where you can apply those skills.
Thank you. Now, Sarah Turner, you had an interesting question. I think you wanted to pose specifically to Cynthia. So would you like to go? Rowena, just pop your hand up if you want to add anything, any stage, and I'll bring you in. Sarah.
Hi, thank you very much, Fiona. Yes, Cynthia, question for you. What skill sets are startups typically looking for from mentors and NEDs?
Hi, good evening, Sarah. Thank you for your question. Well, they tend to want, usually in mentors who can help them with fundraising. That's usually the one thing they're stressing the most about. So if you have experience as an angel or as an investor, that is definitely something extremely useful for them. So that's not really related to tech, but this is something that they're looking for. Legal is a second skill that they're also looking for. They may know a lot about tech, but they usually don't know, the first thing about the term sheets or employment contract or, equity pool or so. Legal is another amazing skill set that they could be looking for, so that they also don't have to pay for the advice early on. But then there is the CFO, so a flying CFO, anyone who really understands the numbers and can help them put, so anyone, it's not just CFO, accounting, audit and finance in general. And then from a tech point of view, it's usually anyone who has a product experience, and it can be B2C or B2B, that's fine. But someone who knows how to, validate assumptions, build the product, how to iterate, when it's time to pivot, when it's not time to pivot. And I think, that product experience, especially on the tech side, is extremely important. There's a skill set that we don't really think about, but that's very relevant. And that's experience that a lot of people can transfer to tech startups. It's business development. You don't need to have been in sales or in business development to really work with startups, but just knowing the corporate world really well is extremely useful as well for B2B tech startups, because they may know about product, they may even know about their market, but some of them has never put, the first foot into a corporate. They don't know anything about procurement. They don't know how long it's going to take. They think, that getting a pilot is going to be easy. They think that, validating assumptions only, requires talking to 3 people. And, they have no clue how it actually works. And this is where I see a lot of people from banks, consulting companies or industrial corporates actually being amazing mentors, because they will either open doors or put them in contact with people who can not necessarily give them a contract, but at least answer questions. And that can be questions about pricing, about, what other products do they use, why they would not use their product, even if it's better, compared to what they already have. And the question could be regulatory, could be a lot of different reasons. There could be, talking to people in HR or in accounting or on the front office about, different, about their experience and what they would want to change in their company. A lot of things that can be very helpful at the early stage of product development. That can really make a difference between going after the wrong opportunity or the right one. So I think, those are very transferable skills that we don't always think about, but are also very important. I hope I answered your question.
Oh
Sarah.
my gosh, Cynthia, I think you did more than that. You blew our heads off there, because it shows you the extent to which startups need support. Jacqui, I'll bring you in. Mary, pop your hand up if you want to. I know you've been involved with a startup, which you've talked about, I think, in your podcast. Is it DocuSign, or there's something you've been involved with that's sort of friend, it's related. It's very different from being on a listed. So maybe you wouldn't mind sharing us the differences that you feel and how you bring to that startup.
Yeah, listen, DocuSign's actually a really big company now. So I think it's floated, but I think there are lots of different types of boards you can get involved in. Certainly one of the best commitments I made was actually joining the board of the Tech Partnership and the board of the CBI. So those were the 2 first boards that I joined. The CBI, I was invited to chair the public services boards for all industries that provide services to the government. And advisory boards are different from listed boards, and of course these are not startups in that way, but I would think that getting any kind of board experience in those types of forums can be valuable. From the CBI, there was a lot of networking, a lot of different types of companies that engaged with the CBI. From the Tech Partnership, it was actually more about getting involved in education and sponsoring more girls into technology. The DocuSign experience was slightly different, so it's more about, I think Cynthia said it, they were looking for an advisory board of people who could help them understand how to take their product and make it relevant for different industries. And for those of you who work in the IT services industry, you can find yourself working in defence or in oil and gas or manufacturing or telco, and every application of that technology can be quite different. And quite often what you get with the startups is they kind of know what their technology is capable of, but they don't necessarily know how to apply it in an industry context, and that's where you can add value.
I've got a question from Lara next, but was there anything, Mary, you wanted to add to that?
I just wanted to say something very quickly. Jacqui mentioned advisory board, and that is a really good way of starting your NED journey, is to join an advisory board, because they're not as formal as main boards, and you can get some great experience on that strategic consultative overview that everybody's looking for at interview. So it's a great start, an advisory board. I'd recommend it to anyone.
Thank you.
I would also add industry associations, which if you're still in your executive career, you know, British Isles Tandem User Group was the first industry association I chaired. So although sometimes they feel a bit unexciting, they can really build some skills.
Thank you, Rowena. Lara, do you want to ask your question, which was really about the dynamics of the boardroom and dealing with the people once you're in there, I think?
Yes, I had two questions, Fiona, but they are related, if I may ask them. The first question is, what were the top 2-3 challenges you might have faced when you transitioned from an executive role to an NED role? And related to that is, what is the best way as an NED to deal with conflict situations and or aggressive personalities which you may encounter on the board?
Surely that doesn't happen. I'm going to ask Jacqui first, because I think actually Mary talked about how you demonstrate that you understand the role of a non-exec, because she sort of pushed that point that if you sound too executive. So Jacqui, come in. Mary, if you want to add anything to that, and then I'll bring Cynthia in. Jacqui first, please.
Yeah, I think the, you know, when you're first joining a board, that there are a couple of challenges. Certainly when you come straight out of an executive career, and the first thing is to not ask too detailed a question. Because it sort of gives away the game that you're kind of interested in how they're actually managing or executing something. And I also, the second challenge I had was a little bit because of my background and experience. They wanted to perhaps the executive wanted to use me more than was really required, you know, than you were really responsible for as a NED. And you really have to, you know, you have to watch that line between getting too engaged and potentially providing too much advice to the kind of overseeing role. So I think being an executive, it was, you know, I would say I wasn't perfect, perhaps gave a little bit too much advice early on in the days, got a little bit too involved with some things because the executive thought, well, hey, you know, Jacqui's done this before, or she's seen this before, we can get her engaged a bit more. I think on the conflict side, I think if you're dealing with any sort of conflicts, I mean that every board should have a deputy or a SID, and if the conflict's with the chair, then the SID is often a good person to talk to about any challenging behaviour or situations that isn't being dealt with by the chair. Normally, a good chair will observe any sort of conflict, and in my experience, a good chair will navigate around that quite well. But if they're not dealing with it, then I would suggest that you talk to the person who has the role of the senior independent director or the deputy.
Choosing the board's quite important there. And Mary, would you like to come in?
Yes, I just wanted to echo what Jacqui was saying, actually, because that big picture, those big picture questions, I always say to candidates, you must go into the interview with big picture questions, strategic questions. Please don't start asking about the detail and the technology, because that's one way you can prepare for and show you're thinking about that. And I even give them advice of saying, stop reading Wired and read The Economist instead, and just get the sort of more strategic view. And then Jacqui's other comment was really good. You've got to be really careful you don't get involved in loads and loads of extra projects that you may not get paid for. particularly mentoring. And I've had this issue with non-execs that I've placed. I've always made it very clear in terms of the time commitment. And there's always been an extra bit in the letter, in their letter, saying there will be extra payment for any extra projects or any extra mentoring that they do. And you've got to be quite clear about that. I don't know much about startups. The feedback I get from startups, and Cynthia will know this much better than me, is that they can be quite demanding sometimes of their NEDs, but I'll let Cynthia deal with that one. But you just want to be careful as an NED, especially if you've got a full-time role as well. You know, your time is valuable.
Cynthia, would you like to come to that? And I just want to give you a prep. Annette, I'm going to bring you in very, very briefly, if you wouldn't mind, just to make your point. And then what I'm intending to do is to go to breakout rooms so we can do a bit of networking. And Rowena, Antsy has asked a really interesting question, which maybe you'd like to have a read of and then closed with the answer to that question, because it's a big one. That's all I'm saying. Cynthia, any comments on that?
Yes, so as you would expect, on the startup side, they're extremely demanding. I think if you're a non-executive director in all the way to Series B, yeah, the life of an entrepreneur is up and downs. It can be really high when it's great. They can be really, really down. They will ask you everything and anything. You have to learn how to say no. You also have to remember that you're there to advise, and therefore there is an aspect of teaching. You're there to pass on your knowledge and your expertise, but you also want them to take, the initiative to actually take the decision on their own. And I think that's very important, because if you're always there to mother them and to hold their hand, you're not really preparing them for the real world. And there is a point where, they will keep on scaling. You may keep on going with them, or you may not. So I think, it's important to set limits. There was an aspect of the question on conflict. Believe it or not, that also happens early stage. There is politics everywhere. And my advice there would be, don't ignore it. I have seen female colleagues thinking, well, it's not a big deal. I won't say anything. I don't want to be a troublemaker. I kind of disagree with that. I think if we let it slip once, then we keep on letting it slip. There is still sexism everywhere you go. And I don't think it's okay. That doesn't mean that you have to make a big case and call the newspaper for it. But you can talk to the person one-on-one, let them know that this is not okay. And if that keeps on escalating, telling this founder, have you noticed anything? Because this is starting to bother me. This is not the company that I joined. Those are not the values that I respect and I represent. So anything along those lines, or if there is something wrong in the company, so wrongdoing, or things that are a bit more borderline, too much borderline on the legal side, you also need to speak up. Those can create conflicts at the board level, and that's your responsibility to address them. So never shy away from conflict. I know it's awkward, I know it's uncomfortable, but I think that also makes us great non-executive directors.
It's a very, very good question, Lara, that you posed at the end. So thank you for that, and very valid comments being made by everyone there. Annette, do you want to just make your point before I move you into breakout rooms? And just to let you know, whilst I'm assigning them, so I'm going to automatically assign them. So it's going to be 4 or 5, and that's your opportunity to really network with the fabulous people in the room. If you are going to leave, do leave quickly, so that I can just adjust the breakout rooms there. But thank you very much. And for the speakers, if you are in a breakout room, including Rowena and Annette, Audrey, if you're in a breakout room with one of the other speakers, can you leave and come back to the middle? Just one of you. Agree that very, very quickly, bounce back and I'll reassign you. Annette, over to you.
Yeah, just very briefly, I wanted to make a comment about ensuring, if you do get the opportunity to have an interview for a non-exec director position, think really hard about the types of questions you might be asked, and prepare really, really well in advance, detailed answers. And the sort of things I've got in mind are, I was recently asked about conflicts that I'd seen on boards that I'd been on. And in the interview pressure, if you haven't really thought through which of the various conflicts you want to bring up at that interview, and you want to explain in some detail how you handled it, you might fluff it. So think through tricky questions that people might ask you and think what your response would be. And I just wanted to open it up, but we may not have time at this stage to see what other tricky questions people can think about. Maybe the breakout rooms.
I think that's a great thing for the breakout rooms. Mary, any comments that you want to make on that? Because you can ask headhunters for support in questions to ask. I always say be careful being too vulnerable in front of a headhunter, but with you, Mary, I would say be vulnerable, because you'll pep them up and support them, because I know you. Any comments on that in terms of preparing for those difficult questions?
Yes, I think I was interested in what Cynthia touched on, that terrible word sexism that we all have to deal with. And I'm sometimes, over the years, I've been quite horrified by some of the questions that have been asked to candidates, particularly female candidates. But it's actually a lot better now. And but the thing about, coming back to the thing about the competition, you will be asked some really hard questions, much harder than you would in a normal role, because with a normal role, you know what you do and you know actually how to handle most questions. But the board, they're trying to get to know you a bit better. And so you need to be prepared for those, and also make sure you've got the boundaries as well, and make sure that it's firmly about business and firmly about particular scenarios. And I'd echo what Annette just said about think through these sort of questions. When did I handle conflict? What happened? How did I resolve it well? And make sure you've got a good example of when you resolved it well. And just think through that. And a headhunter can help you with those questions, because as I said before, the headhunter knows their client. The headhunter knows the sort of questions that client's going to ask, and just call the headhunter and say, look, what sort of questions should I be preparing myself for? Just ask them. And it's interesting what Fiona said, is don't be too vulnerable with a headhunter. And I think she's got a good point there, until you know your headhunter well. But a headhunter wants someone to get that job. I've got a couple of searches now I really want off my desk. I mean, they've been troubling me for ages. They're really, really difficult. So I want the best person to get the job. So I'm going to help all my candidates as much as I can. So, do use the headhunter. They're paid by the client to do that job.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Right, I'm going to move you into breakout rooms. So if you don't want to go into breakout room, leave now. But this is your opportunity to chat and meet. And everyone's talked about networking, building up your network. So it is extremely valuable. You don't know who you're going to meet, and enjoy. I'm going to pop you into breakout rooms for 10 minutes before we move for a bit of closing statement when Rowena is going to answer Ance's question. So thank you very much.
That question about how to transition from an advisory board to a commercial board. Very often people are very happy to have the conversation. They want to bring you in. I've been asked to come in on a couple of occasions. But when it comes to taking a risk on somebody who doesn't have commercial experience, they're a little bit hesitant. So my question is, how do you close?
So you mean in terms of moving from an advisory board to a main board? Exactly so. Yes. I think it just goes back to what I was saying before. I think it's just a question of, I think it's a question of finding the right gap on the right board. Because if you've got a lot of advisory board experience, you're actually a really good candidate. And I think what you might have found is that maybe you're not casting your net wide enough. And maybe you should, I'm just trying to think of something sort of useful. I think the answer is actually you're probably not casting the net wide enough. I think you just need to keep are you actually applying for roles as a non-exec? Are you actually connected with headhunters and applying for those positions? You just want to close the deal, basically. Yeah, I think it's just a question of just finding the right board.
Right. Right.
It's something
perhaps not sort of something a little bit more creative. Just thinking a little bit more creatively about what I'm applying for, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question of finding the right board. And also, are you currently in an operational role at the moment?
No, I'm not.
All right, because that often puts people off. No, I think, to be honest, I think it's a question of finding the right board, and coming back to something Jacqui said about, you really can cross sector. You really can move into quite a different sector on a board. So I think it's finding the right board who want the right sort of skills and experience and what you have. And I can't see any other issue at all by that. I mean, I don't get a lot of people struggling too hard with that transition, but you have to cast the net pretty wide.
Thank you very much. Very helpful.
Okay, Annika, thank you very much. And it makes you very memorable that I get your name wrong every time, because we've got an Nancy in our group and we know that story. Stephanie, I know you wanted to come in, and then I will close on behalf of Rowena. Stephanie.
Well, it's been a fantastic event. I really appreciate all the speakers and some of the things that have come out tonight, which I think are excellent. I guess what I would say to Annika is headhunters are fabulous, and it's really important to get to know them, to get hold of them relatively regularly, to let them know what you're doing and what you're interested in and what your transferable skills are. I think that was a fabulous point, which definitely goes, but I think it's not to be underestimated staying in touch closely with your network. So people that this network, Women on Boards, WiTT, but other networks that you have and professionals that you've been in touch with, don't lose touch with them and ask advice. I think that would be one of the my main comments. Is I think the best way to work out where to go next is ask lots of advice, because everybody's excited to give it.
That is a fantastic ending, Stephanie, because I know WiTT and Women on Boards have had an enormous relationship right from the start. And in fact, you were one of our first speakers. I remember you talking at Bowen, Leighton and Paisner many years ago about your board experience. So thank you so much for that contribution. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Cynthia. And thank you, Jacqui. And thank you, Audrey, as well, for working with Rowena to put this fantastic event together. We can't say enough how much it is to have a strong community, a support community where it's safe to ask those questions, and we can't do it without the generosity of Mary stepping up, as she's done many occasions, Jacqui, and also Cynthia. Very different people, very different styles, many opportunities out there. It's tough, it's hard work, rejection is part of the process. Mary said it's a competitive world out there. Good luck. We really want to help you, and any support you need, we're here, WiTT are here, so thank you. Audrey, is there anything you'd like to say and come in and close? If not, I will close the session and wish you a very good evening. Audrey.
The only thing I'd like to add, Fiona, is that for those on the call who are WiTT members, you will have seen an email to say that our next event is on the 11th of October, which is one of our TED circles. And if there's anybody who isn't a WiTT member, but you're interested in this, we screen a TED Talk and we talk about it. And we're doing this one on International Day of the Girl, and the theme is optimism. Then just send a note to one of us and we'll get you on the list for that. And in November, we have our Women Tech Entrepreneurs event, which is always fascinating. So just check the WiTT website for those.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And thank you again. Thank you, Rowena, also for chairing this session and helping facilitate to put it together. So I think that's good night from me, good night from WiTT, and good night from Women on Boards. Thank you very much.